right, so we're live.
Good evening and welcome to this forum being presented to you by Union Baptist Church, its Social Justice Ministry and Women of Spirit Ministry. This is Pews to the Polls, and we are really thinking about how to mobilize the vote during a pandemic. We all know that these are very critical times and very important times for each of us to think about our own civic responsibility. We also know that these times are made much more challenging by the pandemic and many other social factors that are at play at this time. And so we wanted to bring in some very special guests tonight to talk with us and have a dialogue about how we as people of faith can think seriously about mobilizing ourselves and our communities to really show up on Election Day or early voting, if that is what you plan to do. I'm grateful for all of these panelists tonight. I'm grateful for our moderator, Reverend Stephen Green, and you'll hear more about each of them in just a moment. But on behalf of all of the members of this church, yours truly, Prince Rivers, just grateful for this opportunity. I think we're going to go now to our next item, and I think that's Deacon Elijah Bazemore.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let us pray. Precious God in heaven, we just want to thank you for affording us this opportunity to come together and see how we can get our congregants from the pews to the polls. Father God, we just ask that you order our steps this evening, that you bless this event, that our hearts will be fed and we'll be educated about the important things that are going on in our community that will affect us beyond today. Dear God, we just thank you and praise you for all the individuals that have so ancestrously given up their time this afternoon to serve your people. Dear God, we thank you and we praise you for this event. These blessings we ask in your precious name. Amen.
Hello, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists today. Now, needless to say, I could probably spend about 30 minutes on your own searches for a more extensive bio, but I'm going to share just a little bit with you about each one of them. First, we have Ronnie Chatterji. Ronnie Chatterji is the Democratic nominee for state treasurer. He's a husband, the father of 3 young, beautiful children, an economist, and an educator. And Ronnie is running for treasurer to bring North Carolina's economy back from the brink after COVID-19, to protect our healthcare and to get people back to work. He served as senior economist as the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, and is currently a tenured professor at Duke University. And even though his bio that he sent us didn't say this, I can tell you that recently Ronnie received one of the highest honors that a faculty can receive at Duke, and he was actually, he is now a distinguished professor and is chaired. He received his PhD from the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley, and his BA in economics from Cornell University. Welcome, Ronnie. Next, we have Dr. Timothy Lovelace, Jr. Tim is a professor of law and the John Hope Franklin Research Scholar at the Duke University School of Law. He teaches courses in American legal history, constitutional law, and race and law. His scholarship examines how the U.S. civil rights movement shaped international human rights law. He earned his JD and his PhD from the University of Virginia. He and his family recently located to Durham from Indiana by way of UVA. And my family, especially my daughter, is especially happy that he's here because my daughter and his daughter are really good friends. We have Aisha Benton. She is a performer, poet, preacher, and public policy practitioner. A native and current resident of the city of Detroit, she has studied at the University of Michigan, the University of Oxford, and Duke University. She holds a bachelor's degree in theater and drama, a master of theological studies, and a master of public policy. She is the founder of Yet Once More, an anti-racism consulting firm whose mission is to eradicate racism in individuals, families, organizations, and institutions. And I'm going to take a guess that she is probably a very, very busy consultant these days. She's a lover of the local church. Aisha served the body of Christ by teaching and preaching in the United States, England, and South Africa, and she does so currently at the Ark, Detroit. And finally, we have our moderator, Stephen Green. And before we I go to Stephen Green, I just want to acknowledge that you may have seen another picture that was on the program and the advertisement, and that was for Chief Justice Beasley, who unfortunately was not able to join us due to another commitment that came up at the last minute. But we want to make sure that we will acknowledge her, and she intended to be here, but unfortunately couldn't. Finally, our moderator, which is the Reverend Stephen Green. As one of the nation's youngest leading human and civil rights activists, he has led mobilizations and nonviolent direct action campaigns across the country. He previously served as the National Director of the Youth and College Division of the NAACP, the nation's oldest, largest, and most widely respected grassroots civil rights organization. In this role, he oversaw an army of more than 30,000 young activists across 800 active youth councils and college chapters throughout the nation. I think you'll understand why he has the name, the social justice preacher. He currently serves as the pastor at Greater Allen AME Cathedral in New York. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Religion from Morehouse and a Master of Divinity from the University of Chicago. He is a proud life member of KA Psi, and he is most importantly, he is embraced by a loving family, his parents, Bishop Samuel L. Green Jr. and Dr. Ava S.B. Green, and brothers, Reverend Samuel L. Jr. and Adam S. Green. And with that, I will throw it back to our pastor, who I believe has some additional opening words.
I don't really have much at this point other than just to say how glad I am that everyone is here. I think this is going to be a lively discussion and one that will lead us from this moment to be able to do what each of us knows we need to do, and hopefully inspire some others along the way. So I want to step back and ask Reverend Green to get us open and get us started. Thank you for being here.
Well,
thank you, Dr. Rosette, for wonderful introductions.
To all of you all for your introductions, and to this entire cadre of panelists who are joining us for this conversation, and for the many who are viewing this webinar and watching online. We are excited about this very pivotal conversation about moving from the pew to the polls in the midst of this pandemic, which we know is a dual pandemic. The pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of COVID-16-19, of structural racism that continues to permeate the very soul of this nation. But as we dive deep into this conversation tonight, we want to begin by just talking about the role of the church in this current political climate. As we see a precipitous decline in ecclesial political influence and witness the rise of grassroots representation in the streets, what we have seen move from churches and from the fellowship hall and basements of churches is now happening on the streets, and the young people are organizing in the streets. What do we believe, what as the panelists tonight, as we begin to kick off this conversation, is the church's role in this very current political climate, and what should the church be doing today?
Do you want me to go first, Reverend Green?
Yes, anyone can start. You can go.
Oh, fantastic. I just wanted to make sure. And thank you, Reverend Green, Reverend Rivers, and also my fellow panelists, and Professor Ashleigh Rosette, who has been my good friend and colleague at Duke for a long time. Ashleigh is the one who, for the first time, brought me to Union Baptist Church and sat with me and introduced me to so many of the folks who are here today. So I want to thank her specifically for that. You know, I think the church at this time is our conscience. And it's also centering us in a world of misinformation and misdirection. It's got to be our core, because there's so many other institutions that have been torn down and undermined. And so for us, I think the church has to play that stabilizing role to help us hold on to what truth is. I also think that in this era, it also has to help us find our voice in the political system. one of the challenges is that there are many new political movements that sprouted up in the last 10 years. Many of them are having a huge impact on discourse in this country, and elections like mine, even for state treasurer. And for folks who are in the church and the church community, you have to find a way to connect to these movements as well and help them grow together. And that's something I think is going to be really, really important. So it's something I'm very optimistic about for this election, but more importantly, optimistic going forward in communities like mine in Durham and across the country.
Thank you so much. Sister Benton.
So I think I agree with everything that Ronnie just said. I think additionally, one of the ways that churches are overlooked, kind of thinking about various approaches to serving the community. So we have social service and kind of governmental approaches to serving community. We have philanthropic approaches to serving community. And I think one of the ways that the church kind of throughout American history, particularly when we're talking about the Black church, the church has always been a hub of social services. The church has always been a hub for employment connections. And so I think that there's an incredible amount of kind of grassroots organizing capital that the church has built up over time, that as the church has kind of in some sense been unseated from a place of authority in the eyes of the public, but always having authority kind of spiritually, of course. I think one of the ways that the church has been unseated, it has caused kind of a decline of trust and credibility. And I think the church has a unique opportunity at this point in history to rise, to reclaim that, and to organize. We are denominations notwithstanding, we're an incredibly powerful network. And I think as we envision what it looks like to kind of continue to move forward, the church can't be overlooked for its organizing power, its social capital, and the ways in which the church is pregnant with opportunity to be a hub for social services.
Thank you so much. Dr. Lovelace, you want to chime in?
Sure. Churches are already, playing a huge role in what we see going on. And it takes, this is happening in multiple ways. There are some churches that are not speaking to the issues of today, things like Black Lives Matter, right? And so that the church in this way, or some churches in this way, are following a long line of practices where they've used the Bible to justify racial subordination. And there's a long history there. Churches who've used biblical justifications for slavery, for Jim Crow, and now for mass incarceration. And so I think that we have some churches there, but I think that the greatness of more progressive churches, from slavery to the civil rights movement, is that these churches gave people spiritual vocabulary for talking about freedom, that they bridged sacred concerns to secular concerns, that racism was not simply socially or politically bad, but racism was also sin. And for Black people, this meant that we did not have to wait until we got to heaven to experience freedom, that we could experience it here on earth. And that this was a living faith. This was a faith where praying was not enough. It was faith without works is dead. Whether you see this in the Montgomery bus boycott, people literally walking out their faith in demonstrations in the 1960s in Birmingham or Greensboro or Durham, in Selma at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that is a walk of faith. And so I think that the church today, the progressive churches, have to begin to give people a blueprint to think about justice, and not simply on November 3rd, but also on November 4th. What does a legislative agenda look like going forward, a faith-based legislative agenda? I think it's incumbent on churches right now to do this.
I thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Lovelace, around this moral framing around this election. This is election that is very pivotal for the future of this nation and what we are sensing by just reading the Times and reading the tea leaves is that there are implications for this election that are far different and far vast than any of the elections we've experienced at state, experienced before. And so I just want to talk about what's at stake in this election. And we'll go with you, my dear sister Aisha, to talk about what is at stake in this election. What's at stake? What is on the line for us in 2020?
I think there's so much on the line. I know that it has been said almost as a common refrain, but I believe it's true that in some sense the soul of the nation is on the line. We are really at an inflection point as it relates to so many things in this country that we've seen this year. But I think particularly as it relates to the work that I do at the Department of Health and Human Services, Black lives are on the line as it relates to this pandemic. And we've seen racial disparities statewide, and we've seen kind of what is at stake when a blatant disregard for kind of scientific development takes its toll on Black folks the worst. And this is not something that is isolated as it relates to COVID. We know that disparate health outcomes affect us kind of writ large, everything from diabetes to heart disease to high blood pressure to maternal mortality. So we have disparities left and right, and we know and are starting to acknowledge that these disparities lead to a meta-narrative, which is the fact that racism is a public health crisis. And so I think if there's one thing that I can say, there's so many things that are on the line right now, but I don't think that we can afford to have 4 more years of a practicing racist in the White House. And I acknowledge that, you know, there are people who might disagree with that assertion, but we know a tree by the fruit it bears. And what we are seeing at this point in American history, and it can get worse, is a blatant, you know, rising up of segments of our society that have been kind of hidden. But there's a boldness that's emerging. And I think if we don't take steps to quell that, there is a dismantling that can continue to happen in the likes of which we don't know how that will fully be articulated. So I think it's incredibly dangerous.
No, thank you for that and for framing it as this is truly a dangerous moment. And Dr. Lovelace, would you want to chime in here about the danger and what's truly at stake in this election for our hearers and listeners?
Absolutely. I think my comments in many ways follow Sister Aisha here. Democracy is on the line. At the highest levels of government, we are experiencing just a clear flouting of the rule of law, that we have an autocrat, and we're just facing, the life of democracy going forward. And we also have to think, on state and local levels, right? So that there are, enablers of what we see, all the ugliness that we see. And so not only talking about what's going on federal level, but also in state and local levels. But I think that this is also a real point of contingency, that people have been protesting in the streets literally every day since George Floyd was murdered. And we might expect this in places like New York or LA or Chicago, big cities, but there have been protests even in the suburbs. And this is unprecedented. And it's often multiracial in nature, right? When you look at some of the crowds, people who are chanting Black Lives Matter and talking about reform are not simply African American. And so I think that this gives us, or should give us, a lot of hope. And so I think that we're at a moment where America could change, either for the worse and drastically so, or there could be a new future of freedom.
Yes, there's a lot on the line that can change the trajectory of this nation. And as we continue to decipher what this plan and this step is ahead of this nation, we also recognize, as you lifted up, that this is about not just the national, the federal election, but also on state and local elections. And so Dr. Chatterji, did I say that right?
You did?
Okay, great. If you could just talk about the implications that are on all of these levels of our elections this year, and what's at stake for the future of our democracy that is going to be impacted on the state and local levels as well.
Yes, and I think our previous two panelists have made fantastic points, and I'm learning as I'm participating here as well. For me, this is why I ran for office this year. I've never run for office before. I'm a first-time candidate. I'm an economist, an academic, someone who never thought I'd get involved in politics. And I think this is what this election cycle is about, bringing people into the process who've never been involved before. What's on the line? I think our jobs are on the line, our health is on the line, and our lives are on the line. I mean, let's start just with jobs. I'm an economist, so I'll talk about that. Look at the condition of small businesses across this country, particularly minority-owned businesses that were hit so hard by COVID-19. And look at the inadequate response from the federal government with a program that was called PPP, Paycheck Protection Plan. Well, it didn't protect the paychecks of a lot of folks I know in North Carolina, particularly Black-owned businesses. That's because the banks that doled out the money gave preference to larger clients, big companies like Shake Shack or professional sports franchises, but not minority-owned businesses. That's one thing that's at stake at this election. Another thing, a lot of Black and brown people work for state and local government. We're disproportionately represented in our state and local governments. But right now, our state and local governments have huge budget holes, and they're considering furloughs. In any functioning democracy, we would see state and local aid come from the federal government. A big part of the federal government's role is to take care of states during a global pandemic. But that bill is being held up. And as a result, we're going to see tons of jobs losses in terms of state and local government, again, disproportionately affecting Black and brown people. Our health is also on the line. When the CDC guidance is undermined or politicized, and we are not getting correct information about how this virus is spreading and how many people are dying, we know that the impact is being felt mostly in Black and brown communities. And it's going to continue unless we fix our institutions after this election. And the last thing is our lives. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, the president came to Greenville, North Carolina, and there was a speech, one of those red meat speeches, where the crowd at one point was chanting, "Send them back, send them back, send them back." They're talking about people like me, my kids. They're talking about people on this Zoom chat. That's what's at stake in this election if we don't stand up and have our voice heard. And that's why people like me and countless others around the country are running for office and getting involved for it the first time. So I think those are the things that I think are at stake.
Oh, thank you. And we know that everything is at stake as far as relates to our education. Now the Supreme Court hangs in the balance. What this means for the future of pivotal decisions, as we note that this is a very unique time in our nation's history. And that's why this conversation is so important for faith communities to lead and be at the center of these conversations, is because we don't know what might happen when we go to sleep on November 3rd and we wake up on November 4th and we've realized that ballots are still being counted, that you have a president that intends to deny the effectiveness of our electoral process, if you will, and to question the legitimacy of this process. And all of these things are creating a level of anxiety, a level of frustration, a level of weariness for people who are consistently having to face the realities of what is ahead of this nation. And all of this is coupled with the reality that each and every day, you don't know whether or not you can be in your home in Louisville, Kentucky, sleeping peacefully at night. You could be coming out of a convenience store in Minneapolis, Minnesota. You could be walking in your neighborhood in Sanford, Florida with a hoodie on and iced tea and Skittles in your hands. Or you can be a young child at the age of 12 years old like Tamir Rice. And we realize that not only are we facing the realities of an election that continue to create query and worriness with what's on the front line, but that truly we are dealing with the reality that systemic racism is still prevalent, and that Black men and young Black women are young Black men are twice as likely to die at the hands of police and their white counterparts, but it in fact impacts Black and brown people 3.5 times more than white our white counterparts to be killed by police, even when we do not attack or have a weapon. So this conversation of defunding the police has become a trending topic, a hot button issue in this conversation around 2020 elections. And so I want to lift up to our conversation today this quote from, or I guess this opinion from Dr. Eddie Glaude, who suggests that defunding the police is draining the pool of being tough on crime, law and order, and the war on drugs. Defunding the police is a reinvestment, a redistribution of resources where we move resources away from aggressive policing and mass incarceration. It is about truly changing our public infrastructure. So I'm gonna ask the panelists rather, what are your immediate reactions to this stance on defunding the police? And in what ways do you imagine public safety beyond policing as? We can start with Dr. Lovelace.
I think that the project of defunding the police is critical, and it exposes just how vicious this system of mass incarceration is. That what defunding the police does, it forces us to try to imagine a world where we don't need so many police officers. We're often, as a society, using criminal law to address social problems, and there's a mismatch there. Defunding the police is forcing us to think about mental health services, education, employment, social support systems that would keep people out of the criminal justice system. And police officers are doing too much, just quite frankly. They have to address issues of homelessness, of mental illness, of violent crime, of drug trafficking, but then they also regulate the traffic of our cars. That we need people who are trained specifically to deal with mental illness or issues of homelessness, and that police officers are just not being trained to deal with these social issues in really effective ways. And so I think that defunding the police is a radical and an important social and legal project.
Thank you. Sister Benton?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think so on a philosophical, ideological level, of course I agree that police officers are generally overstretched and many times underpaid. I think there's also kind of an additional conversation that adds texture to this about what it looks like for community members to rise up and to bear kind of insular policing practices. And I think even kind of shifting the language from policing to something else that feels more generative can be key. But I think in the way that this conversation has played out in public discourse, the way that it has become kind of a hashtag has really been unhelpful to the intent of the defunding the police movement, right? There are many people who don't actually have the conversation that we're having about what it actually means, but the hashtag goes up, and really instead of, and I fully acknowledge that there are some bridges that can't be built into the other side, right? There are some people who, dogmatically, have very bullheaded perspectives. But I think that this particular issue, which at the heart of it is what we're saying, is police officers are not equipped to do everything that we're having them do. It actually is stressful, and to continue to operate in this mode is to their detriment. So what does it look like for us to reallocate some of these resources in order to lighten the burden so police officers can do what they actually need to do and do it well, instead of being mental health practitioners and, folks who have to try to do homeless social services. But I think, so I think that's kind of one of my primary thoughts, is that we really need to have a very textured conversation about this, and even the language that we use as we talk about it, I think should lend itself to having a textured conversation about it. But secondly, I think one of the things that we really need to understand in order to have a conversation about what policing looks like today is we need to understand the history of policing in this country. The fact that it's always been racialized. The fact that, you know, very early on in US history, you know, white indentured servants were given a musket and a plot of land and immunity to kill an indigenous person or an African descendant who was in America. And so from the beginning, policing in this country has been racialized. Policing in this country has been weaponized. It wasn't about protecting and serving, right? And so I think it's important while we're having a conversation to understand the history of policing in this country, that it actually didn't derive from noble origins. And it was a means of protecting the white ruling class. And it was done by the white working class. And it was always done kind of in opposition to people of color in this country. So I think there's kind of different layers to the policing conversation, but I think when we have it and when we have it well, it should be a place that we're able to have common ground, even with those on the opposite end of the political spectrum. Not on everything, but on some things, namely that police officers do too much.
And I just want to add that, what would an investment agenda look like? Where can we be investing? So a couple different areas I think are really important. One is in mental health across states like North Carolina. There are so many people, and this is one of the reasons I ran also. I would run the state health plan for all of our state employees in North Carolina. But there are so many people who don't have access to behavioral health specialists. And if we can expand healthcare, starting with Medicaid expansion, which would benefit 600,000 people in North Carolina, we were one of only, I think, 12 states remaining who haven't done it. This could expand access to mental and behavioral health in a huge way for all people in the state. And it's something we should be thinking about, building mental health networks across the country. COVID-19 is also having an impact on our mental health. And that's something that hasn't been talked enough about. And we're going to have to be picking up the pieces for a long time, even after a vaccine for COVID is developed. Second is education. I mean, we've talked all this about virtual school. There are so many kids who have to go to the parking lot of a Hardee's or a McDonald's just to pick up the internet signal. Are you going to look those kids in the eye and say they can be globally competitive in this economy? These are the same kids who used to be learning in a school building that was crumbling. And we know that school buildings in disrepair are harder for kids to learn. Now you have kids who don't have the devices or the access to internet. So it comes to investing in broadband infrastructure for everyone across this country to actually have access to their education materials and lessons, and repairing school buildings. And the last thing is infrastructure. There's so many examples I know in our home state here in North Carolina where infrastructure has been built right through the center of commerce in a Black or brown neighborhood, splitting that area and making it impossible for entrepreneurs and small businesses to continue. We got to think about investments in infrastructure that should connect people and ideas, connect people to opportunities, but also have an impact, a positive one, on equity and access to affordable housing, things we weren't thinking about when we built much of the physical infrastructure in places like North Carolina and around the country. So that's what an investment agenda could look like and how it can impact people of all kinds, but especially Black and brown people.
Thank you for detailing with the explicit details around an agenda and a political agenda that I believe that can and will help us to imagine a path forward and really realize what Martin King calls beloved community. And I think that it couples, I think, the realities of healthcare, of education, of dealing with reforms to our environment so that we can ensure that we have clean energy and for everyone. But I want to talk now as we transition before we take questions from our listening audience, this idea of voter suppression and what is at stake when we recognize that in the next 35 or so days that we will go to the polls. In an era, this is the second presidential election without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. And we know that 36 states have voter ID laws, and 7 of them are strict with photo ID laws. Thankfully, North Carolina is not one. But it was a decision that was made by the U.S., I believe, Court of Appeals that said with surgical precision, the gerrymandering right, had the way the maps were cut or drawn was with surgical precision. And so we know that folks are truly sitting somewhere trying to define and describe ways to target and to attack this electoral process. Can one of you all speak to the history of voter suppression in America and ways that we in North Carolina can work to counteract the suppression that is taking place in North Carolina and across the country? Maybe we'll go with Dr. Lovelace to begin here.
Okay. The history of voter suppression has been great. I mean, even at the founding, we see voter suppression, right? African Americans are not being enfranchised, right? And so we see this even at the core of the Constitution, right? We're being counted through this 3/5 clause, right? So even as we think about democracy, voter suppression is at the heart of our democracy. We get the 15th Amendment in 1870. This is the 150th year of the 15th Amendment, and African American men get the right to vote. But Reconstruction then begins to happen, and Reconstruction was an incredibly vibrant time. You have people who were formerly enslaved who then become not only voters, but also legislators, right? That there are African Americans in states like North Carolina who enter the legislature, and a state like South Carolina, for one term in the lower house, there was a Black majority. In Mississippi, we see Mississippi, 2 Black senators during Reconstruction. We can't even imagine that now. But after Reconstruction, there was redemption and the rise of Jim Crow, and African Americans were systematically disenfranchised. A crop of new state institutions popped up in the 1890s and in the first decade of the 20th century, disenfranchising African Americans. North Carolina very much had a Jim Crow constitution. And in these constitutions, we see the rise of grandfather clauses, literacy tests, felon disenfranchisement statutes. The idea was that African Americans were more prone to commit certain crimes. And so if you disenfranchise felons, you could also disenfranchise African Americans. And so the criminal justice system and voting rights were often tied at the turn of the 20th century. We get a Voting Rights Act in 1965, but this is the work of just people who are marching and fighting for a right that's textually theirs, right? There's a 15th Amendment, there's a 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. But since Shelby County v. Holder, a Supreme Court decision in 2013, we see the rise of massive voter suppression. There have been great voter purges. There has been a decline in polling places literally being closed, early voting being targeted, voter ID laws, as you recently just spoke to, North Carolina being very much at the center of a law that targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision, quoting this Fourth Circuit decision. And so what we see here is, this is our time. We're facing a pandemic, but we have to come out to vote, whether it's early voting or voting on November 3rd. Our ancestors marched for this.
Yep. We have 4.4 million people who voted for President Obama that did not show up in 2016. And I think we can't have that again. To Reverend Lovelace's point, there are people who shed blood, thinking about, the great American hero, John Lewis, who shed his blood on that bridge in Selma. There are people like him whose names are recorded in the books of history, whose names we may never know and recite, but they did it despite kind of geographical challenges. They tried to vote, despite financial hurdles that were placed in front of them. They tried to vote. Despite kind of structural barriers via, literacy tests, they made efforts to vote anyway. And I think in some sense, what's at the heart of voter suppression, right, is what we need to challenge, right? The spiritual principality, the spiritual kind of messaging that has come through, and I think it's one that many Black people have bought into, which is, I don't have a say so. I don't need to vote because it doesn't matter, because I actually don't have any power. And I think that is what, in some sense, the various ways that voter suppression has played out throughout history. And what we know about racism is that it's articulated in different ways at different times. It manifests different ways at different times. It morphs. What voter suppression has tried to do this entire time is convince people that they don't matter, that their voice doesn't matter, and that they don't have any power. And we know from political power to economic power that people of color, in particular African Americans in this country, are an incredibly powerful share of the electorate. And so I think we would be remiss to stay home like we did in 2016, with everything that's happened, with everything that our ancestors did and fought for us to have a voice and have a say.
And I'll just add in terms of what you can do, because I'm seeing this right now as a person who's in the arena and watching these ballots come in. In North Carolina, Black voters' absentee ballots are being rejected at twice the rate of white voters. This is happening right now. And so we all need to be incredibly vigilant, not just to go vote, yes, but also to make sure that our votes are accountable. A lot of this is technical. It's not showing up in the front pages of the paper, but it's going to affect in what's going to be a very close election in a place like North Carolina or Michigan, where your vote's really going to matter. The second thing I'll say is, please vote the whole ballot. The whole ballot is those state and local races that often have a huge impact on the very issues that we've been talking about, whether it's police reform, environmental justice, or infrastructure. Florida is a great example. Florida passed, the voters voted to enfranchise people who had completed their sentences. But then the Florida legislature and the governor gutted the law. Why do they have so much power in Florida to overrule the will of the people? Well, they've won those midterm elections. They've won those boring state elections that we're not often paying attention to. And so if we cede the state and local races to folks who want to push backwards, even when we do things through the democratic process, they're going to be rolled back. And so voting the whole ballot, all the way down from the governor's mansion to the school board and everything in between, is essential in this election.
Oh, thank you so much for that. And everything is truly essential. If our attendees in this webinar have any questions, or even on Facebook, if you have questions that you would like to ask this panel, this wealth of knowledge that is here amongst us today, and because this is such a critical conversation, and there's some dissent amongst young voters, Gen Z and millennial voters, that the political process is encumbersome. It is slow. It is not bring the level of change and the speed that they anticipate, and they have been frustrated with voting. What do we have to say tonight to encourage these young voters who are disillusioned with democracy, who are disgruntled with where we are as a nation, who are saying that Black Lives Matter started under the Obama administration, and yet we are consistently seeing the destructive realities that are happening towards Black bodies in this nation? And so what are some ways to encourage our young voters who are listening tonight, and for those who may have them in their household, so that we can find the language to communicate and to encourage them even in this critical moment?
I'll just jump in. The alternative to not participating in the political process will get us in an even worse place, right? So while there may never be the perfect candidate, right? The idea here is to get closer to one set of policy proposals, closer to one set of legislative agendas that will take us in some ways forward. you know, I begin to think about this from the framework of, again, of the 1960s. Sit-in activists were frustrated with the slow pace of legal change, of political change, and that drove them out into the streets to protest. That many of the protests were about the insufficiencies of law, and that the legislative process was closed. If we think it's closed now, in the 1960s, right, half century ago, it was no doubt closed then, right? But what happened is their protest helped to create the political context for change. That the sit-in movement in particular, it's 60 years after the formation of SNCC. And SNCC's protest and the protests in places like Birmingham, what they did is they aroused the conscience of America. They also forced legislators to ask different types of questions. And so in this political context, we get a Civil Rights Act of 1964. Because of protest, we get a Voting Rights Act of 1965 in Selma, that the people who went across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and then who tried to march again another time, and there was Turnaround Tuesday, and then there was a third march, right, going from Selma to Montgomery. This pricked the conscience of President Johnson, of people in Congress. A Voting Rights Act was passed, and then the Supreme Court upheld this very strong medicine after the Voting Rights Act was passed. And so I think I take my cues from the past, that our ancestors have given us a roadmap for transforming the political system. If it worked then, I think it can definitely work now.
Yep.
Oh, thank you for that. No, please chime in, my sister. Yes.
I would say that I mean, it sounds mundane to even state it, but this is the system we have. And so if we'd like to change this system, we have to participate in it first. And so I think with the system we have, to Reverend Lovelace's point, there's two options. There's one option, there's another option. And I think what I hope is becoming clear for most people is that one of those options shouldn't even be an option. But furthermore, and it's already been stated several times on this call, if you are putting up hashtags about Breonna Taylor and you lament the fact that she didn't really receive justice, what you have to understand as a young person is that the district attorney is voted in. So the person who had the decision, whether or not those people who killed a Black woman in her sleep should have to answer for that, is someone who was elected into office. And so it's the reason why we really have to participate, because this will continue to happen over and over again, and it will happen legally in some sense for that person to just make a decision that this shouldn't be prosecuted. It can happen in Michigan, where I am next. It can happen in another part of the country. And so I think that's something, if there are any young people listening who are thinking about sitting out and also upset about what happened with Breonna Taylor, you have to connect the dots on those two and understand why your participation in this process is so important.
And I would say, I mean, over the next 36 days is when your power is at its zenith. This is when you need to exhibit your power and vote. Because if you're not participating, if you're not voting, it's a vote for the other side. That's how close these elections are. So think about it like that way. If you're not participating, you're really voting for the other side. And that's exactly what the forces that you're working against want. And so you want to see a change when it comes to climate policy. If you want to see a change on race relations, the systemic racism in this country, if you want to see a change on income and wealth equality, this is the way to begin that change. But once you vote, you should also hold your leaders accountable. I'm very much in favor of not just taking people's votes and then waiting until the next election. That's how we got into the situation we're in. So vote and hold your leaders accountable. And we as folks in the community need to inspire people to vote. I mean, I remember when President Obama ran for office, and that 2008 moment, those 4.4 million voters that she was talking about that showed up, that didn't show up in 16, we need that inspiration back, and all of us got to keep working on that. And that's part of the reason I got involved to begin with. And going forward, we have to continue that with leaders inspiring people to get involved in the process.
Oh, thank you. That is absolutely important, is that we must recognize that civic engagement is a 365 days a year job. That it's not something that we can just do every November. It's not something we need to or do every 4 years in November, but that civic engagement talks about ways that we can engage our elected officials throughout the year, not just when they come to our churches in October for votes, but picking up the phone, but writing letters, but showing up for meetings, but scheduling town halls, and even also preparing our own selves and our own congregations to do exactly what you're doing, brother Dr. Chatterji, and that is to run for office as first-time people, first-time folks, not career politicians, but those who are trying to be a part of the civic process. There's a couple questions around Amy Barrett and her nomination as a Supreme Court justice and why it is important to have a just president in office to relative to the Supreme Court future and to the future of the Supreme Court. And we realize that Supreme Court is so important, as we've seen in recent years, how they made the decision on Shelby v. Holder to gut out Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act. We've seen how they are dealing with our brothers and sisters at the border in cases around DACA and students who are here. And so we recognize the importance of the Supreme Court. And we realize that there may be 2 or 3 seats that may come available here in the next presidential term. And so we recognize how important it is. And so we also want to lift up the importance of police reinvestment or public safety reinvestment. And we talk about defunding police. We're not talking about the individual persons who uphold the badge, but about the systems that are represented by the systems of mass incarceration that are upheld by violent policing. And so ways, particularly in New York, we have the crisis management system where there's an alternative number for people to call in moments of conflict and moments of controversy. So you don't always have to call 911, but you're able to call first responders who are able to deal with mental challenges and things of that sort of disputes. So there's alternatives to public safety. So what we recognize is that in many of our suburban communities, that they are policed while urban communities are surveilled. And so if we would just provide the same level of policing that we provide in urban communities that are not seeing police swarm their neighborhoods in riot gear at 12 o'clock at night as they try to do a no-knock warrant as they did in Louisville, Kentucky, but to just ensure that in neighborhoods that have quality libraries and access to parks and access to grocery stores, that they don't have violent crime as the same rates, and all those things have to deal with it. But I want to thank this awesome cadre of panelists who have been engaging in this conversation, and allow me also to thank Dr. Rosette and my dear brother Dave Young, as well as Deacon Bazemore and the entire company and cadre of leaders at the Union Baptist Church, and also to my dear Morehouse brother and the pastor of this phenomenal congregation, Dr. Prince Rivers. Thank you for the opportunity to convene and to moderate this conversation. And so, Pastor Rivers, I'll turn it over back to you for our closing remarks so that we can keep our time limit and do justice as you all have called us to today. Thank you so much, Pastor Rivers.
Thank you, Reverend Green. I wish this was live so I could give everybody a big round of applause. This was awesome. You all really enlightened us, gave some great perspectives and incredible insights about the issues that are affecting us right now. And if people are listening to this, I really hope that you go out armed with some new information, some wonderful ways of speaking about what is so important to your friends, to your family, to your grandchildren, whoever is old enough to vote, and even those that aren't old enough to vote, because in 4 more years or even 2 more years, they may be old enough to vote. Thank you, Dr. Chatterley. Thank you, Dr. Lovelace. Thank you, Sister Benton. Thank you, Reverend Green. You really enlightened us, and I hope and I pray that the people who listened tonight will be able to take this to heart and go out and be informed voters. We need to vote early. They can't throw your ballot out. Go if you want to wait till election day, that's fine. But whatever you do, make sure that you do not let what other people have done before us be in vain. Thank you, Dr. Rosette and Sharon Oliver and Deacon Bazemore, and to everyone who was on this Zoom call today. We appreciate your presence. We look forward to doing something else between now and Election Day. Hopefully get Chief Justice Beasley back on here and other candidates like Brother Chatterji and those running for other offices as well, because we really want you to know who you're voting for. And Dr. Chatterji had it right. Don't forget about the races down the ballot. You know, everybody's looking at the commercials, but you've got to pay attention to the people that are making laws that affect you and your families every single day. I pray that you all have a great evening. You stay safe, wear your mask, all that good stuff. And just thank you for being here. We look forward to the next time we can get together. Good evening to all of you. Yep. Bye-bye.
Yeah.